Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. This is the third of four lectures on the implications of Nietzsche's philosophy for literary theory, and it's part of our ongoing course on contemporary literary theory. So let's get started. Today, we want to talk about the will to power and perspectivism. So, what is the will to power? This is the fundamental metaphysical principle for Nietzsche, and for him, it denotes fundamental nature of all existence. It's and it it describes all of existence as fundamentally a complex configuration of forces and drives. This is the will to power. It's not, and this is where it can be sometimes, I think, misinterpreted by the superficial reader of Nietzsche, or the, let's say, a populist notion of Nietzsche. Will to power is an individual's willpower. I have a particular person, a tyrant might have a strong willpower to achieve and to control the state in the case of a tyrant. The will to power is more fundamentally a metaphysical principle that describes all of existence as this network or configuration of competing drives and forces. So that individual, that tyrant, is him or herself a function or a complex configuration of these drives, not an individual with a particular strong willpower. This can manifest itself in religious and philosophic systems. So we see, for example, Platonism was a particular configuration for Nietzsche of weak wills seeking an otherworldly justification of existence. Political social structures, nationalism for Nietzsche is a product of declining wills falsifying their identity to find a meaning. Artistic forms is another example of a configuration of the will to power. For him, Greek tragedy, for example, is an expression of act, affirmative wills embracing this existence. In his revaluation of all values, Nietzsche assesses these various religious philosophical systems, political social structures, and artistic forms, not in terms of their being true or false, nor in terms of their being good or bad. And that's the key point about beyond good and evil, as he says in the title of one of his famous works. Rather, he asks whether they are life enhancing, are they affirmative wills, or are they life denying, negative wills? So in the Antichrist, for instance, Nietzsche interprets early Judaism as a product of life enhancing affirmative will to power. Later priestly traditions within Judaism for Nietzsche saw a life denying negative configuration of the will to power hold sway. So Nietzsche needs to find a new basis for positing values and giving meaning to existence. His interpretations of human history have shown that all valuations lack a ground for their notions of truth and morality, yet we cannot live in the absence of these interpretations, these valuations. So the will to power would be Nietzsche's new principle upon which we can posit a new valuation. So to let me try to repeat that. So in the modern age, it's become clear with the death of God, and we talked about that in the last lecture, that there's no grounds for good or evil, true or false. Yet we need to have these valuations. So Nietzsche is saying, okay, well, how are we going to go forward and make a new value positing if we know that there are no grounds? Well, for Nietzsche, we need to make it on the grounds of the will to power itself, the fundamental nature of existence. We need to be true to that principle. So the will to power is essentially connected to Nietzsche's perspectivism. They're basically two sides of the same coin, or one and the same thing. And in in saying that all existence is will to power, or in saying that all existence is perspectival, we're saying that there are no facts or things in themselves, only facts, only perspectives or interpretations. So, in what follows, I'll give a few, just a few, and we could multiply this several fold. So many quotations from Nietzsche to support these claims of his that all existence is perspectival. So we'll go through a couple of key quotes. This is from his collection of notebooks collected as The Will to Power. Uh, and the quote goes, "Against positivism, which halts at phenomena, there are only facts. I would say no, facts is precisely what there is not, only interpretations. We cannot establish any fact in itself. Perhaps it is folly to want to do such a thing. Everything is subjective, you say, but even this is interpretation. The subject is not something given, it is something added and invented and projected behind what there is." So, this is a key point on perspectivism. It's so crucial to understand this key point. Often people say, okay, well, as Nietzsche says in this aphorism, well, perspectivism just means that everything's subjective. I have a perspective, you have a perspective. Nietzsche's perspectivism is much more thoroughgoing. The notion of an I, of a human subject that has a way of viewing the world, I as an individual with some sort of identity am myself a product of different perspectives and forces. There's my drive to be a father and do these things. There's a certain drive to advance my own wealth, or have physical pleasures, or have spiritual enlightenment. There's complex linguistic codes that are uh, manipulating the way I understand the world. So the I as an individual result as various forms of expressions of these configurations of forces. So we'll go back to the quote here. And well, actually, before we do that, I'll just remind you, we talked in the last lecture about how in post-structuralism, the death of the human subject is really brought to the forefront. And here again, we're building on Nietzsche, on the erasure of the human subject, human individual as a locus of trying to understand the world or meaning, and then will lead ultimately to the last topic we'll cover in the course, post-humanism. So back to the quote. "Finally, is it necessary to posit an interpreter behind the interpretation? Even this is invention, hypothesis. Insofar as the word knowledge has any meaning, the world is knowable, but it is interpretable otherwise. It has no meaning behind it, but countless meanings." Perspectivism. "It is our needs that interpret the world, our drives, and their for and against. Every drive is a kind of lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm." So, one of the ways of trying to articulate perspectivism and the will to power is to see to understand Nietzsche's articulation as kind of vector mathematics, that there are forces that can be calculated as having a certain directionality or intentionality and moving in this direction. And we have another force that compels forces to align to its own. And maybe it results in a certain vector of of that configuration that that congeals around a particular cluster of forces and drives. That particular vector is what we see as institutions, as things, as identities, as people, as a particular vector of all these different drives. Another quote, this time from Beyond Good and Evil. And this is from the preface, right at the beginning, and where he's going to talk about perspectivism in contradistinction to the entire Platonic tradition. We should not be ungrateful towards dogmatism, but it must nonetheless be said that the worst, most prolonged, and most dangerous of all errors to this day was a dogmatist's error, namely Plato's invention of pure spirit and the good in itself. But now that it has been overcome and Europe breathes a sigh of relief after this nightmare, and at least can enjoy a healthier, well sleep, we whose task is wakefulness itself are the heirs to all the force cultivated through the struggle against this error. Of course, talking about spirit and the good, like Plato did, meant standing truth on its head and disowning even perspectivism, which is the fundamental condition of all life. So Plato had to deny the perspectival nature of existence and of life, and he had to perform an inversion. And he'll talk in the genealogy of morals of the priestly inversion of values that takes place with the invention of their value system. Back to the quote. In fact, as physicians, we could ask, how could such a disease infect Plato, the most beautiful outgrowth of antiquity? Did the evil Socrates corrupt him after all? Was Socrates, in fact, the corrupter of youth? Did he deserve his hemlock? The struggle against Plato, or to use a clear and popular idiom, the struggle against the Christian ecclesiastical pressure of millennia, since Christianity is Platonism for the people, has created a magnificent tension of spirit in Europe, the likes of which the earth has never known. With such a tension in our bow, we can now shoot to the furthest goals. So the struggle against Platonism has led to the death of God, and this primes us, the strength that has accumulated through this tension in the bow will allow us to create the highest goals now. We'll be able to release the tension of that bow and now shoot at the furthest goals. We can't just, again, this needs to be clear, we can't just stop with the death of God and celebrate that anything's permissible. We have to create new goals. Again, from Beyond Good and Evil. We do not consider the falsity of a judgment as itself an objection to a judgment. This is perhaps where our new language will sound most foreign. The question is how far the judgment promotes and preserves life, how well it preserves and perhaps even cultivates the type. And for this quote, it's good to keep this one in mind in relation to our reading for the course on Nietzsche and contemporary literary theory is the essay on truth and lying in a non-moral sense. So there too, he'll underscore in slightly different language this notion that we're going to have these falsities of judgments, these acts of falsifying the world are absolutely necessary. They're in order to promote and preserve life, and it's a matter of which falsifications are best at doing that. And we are fundamentally inclined to claim that the falsest judgments, which include synthetic judgments a priori, are the most indispensable to us, and that without accepting the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the wholly invented world of the unconditioned and self-identical, without a constant falsification of the world through numbers, people could not live. That a renunciation of false judgments would be a renunciation of life, a negation of life. To acknowledge untruth as a condition of life, this clearly means resisting the usual value feelings in a dangerous manner, and a philosophy that risks such a thing would, by that gesture alone, place itself beyond good and evil. So it's interesting the examples he uses there, that we need the falsifications that we use in mathematical thinking, that we reduce things to numbers, for instance, or we reduce things through putting concepts such as the self-identical on it. So an example we might use is going to open a door. I don't think about the door. I assume that's the same door I encountered a half an hour ago when I entered the room, and that the door is going to function and it's identical, even though perhaps the material makeup of that door has changed, temporally it's changed, these types of things. I assume an identity that's fixed, and I impose that on the flux of becoming, and the flux of particles and photons that are hitting the back of my eyeballs. I impose that on the world, and without doing that, I wouldn't be able to get through any operation in my day-to-day life. That is a fiction that is absolutely necessary to live. Another quote from Beyond Good and Evil. You must forgive an old philologist like me. Remember, philology is the study of words. Philo, love, logos, word. Philologist. So you must forgive an old philologist like me who cannot help maliciously putting his finger on tricks of interpretation. But his, but this quote, conformity of nature to law, which you physicists are so proud of, just as if X exists only because of your interpretation and bad philology. It is not a matter of fact, not a text, but instead only a naive humanitarian correction and a distortion of meaning that you use in order to comfortably accommodate the democratic instincts of the modern soul. Everywhere equality before the law. In this respect, nature is no different and no better off than we are. So interesting here that he uses a metaphor of interpreting a text. So just as we interpret texts, there's a text there, and we try to interpret it and make sense of it. So too in our interactions with the physical world, and physicists are doing the same thing, says Nietzsche, when they go and they see in the world nature conforming to a law. They see a law there, and they think that that's in the world, and they're not positing it. They're discovering it. But Nietzsche is saying, no, you've imposed that as an interpretation on the world as text. And the reason you're doing it, he says, is because you have a democratic instinct. You're the configuration of democ the democratic forces and will to power that currently reigns. And according to the democratic instinct, there has to be equality before the law. So you impose that on the world, says Nietzsche. To continue with the quote, but as I have said, this is interpretation, not text. And somebody with an opposite intention and mode of interpretation could come along and be able to read from the same nature and with reference to the same set of appearances, a tyrannically ruthless and pitiless execution of power claims. This sort of interpreter would show the unequivocal and unconditional nature of all will to power so vividly and graphically that almost every word, and even the word tyranny, would ultimately seem useless or like weakening and mollifying metaphors and too humanizing. Granted, this is only an interpretation too, and you will be eager enough to make this objection. Well, then, so much the better. So let's try to unpack that quote a bit. So he's saying, you physicists have that interpretation of nature, which is only an interpretation that sees it as following or conforming to a law. Now, another interpreter, let's say Nietzsche, could come along and see in nature striving of drives and a will to power. And this would be an equally valid interpretation, let us say. And this is the point at the end of the quote. Granted, this is only an interpretation too. So Nietzsche's interpretation of nature as will to power is an interpretation. He grants that. And you'll be eager enough to make that claim. So this is uh, often the claim put against Nietzsche's perspectivism. And, it's a simple enough claim to make. And when I'm talking about Nietzsche in the classroom, the more astute students, even in first year, will come along and say, yeah, but perspectivism, isn't that just one perspective, right? And for Nietzsche here, he's saying, far from a refutation of his claim, you've had to say, yeah, if you're granting that my claim is an interpretation like all interpretations, then you've absolutely had to affirm my claim that there is only interpretation. There is only perspective. And that's why his last line there is, well, then, so much the better. So much the better then. Well, what is the difference then between your interpretation, your perspective of nature as will to power, and the physicists then? This is where we return to the will to power as the principle of a new valuation. How can we interpret Nietzsche's as better, let's say, as a good interpretation or as a true interpretation as opposed to the other interpretation? Well, in what sense is it grounded in the advancement of the will to power, the advancement of life? Is it life enhancing or life denying? This is, again, Nietzsche's principle. So another quote here from The Will to Power, his collection of notes. No limit to the ways in which the world can be interpreted. Every interpretation a symptom of growth or decline. So here's the principle, right? So for him, he calls himself a physiologist. So he looks at the history of of cultures and sees them as symptoms of growth or decline. Inertia needs unity, monism, plurality of interpretations, a sign of strength, not to desire to deprive the world of its disturbing and enigmatic character. So this is, I find interesting. Um, I find it interesting that he sees, let's say, diversity of claims or the ability to withstand a diversity of perspectives a sign of strength. And I think this is what's interesting for those who claim Nietzsche on the extreme right or the extreme left is there's often almost a tendency to monism, like a tendency not to want to hear the other side because of their extreme totalitarian claims on each side. Um, but Nietzsche would see as a symptom of growth, as a symptom of strength, a particular interpretation that allows for a diversity of claims. Another quote from The Will to Power. Interpretation, the introduction of meaning, not explanation. In most cases, a new interpretation over an old interpretation that has become incomprehensible, that is now itself only a sign. There are no facts. Everything is in flux, incomprehensible, elusive. What is relatively most enduring? Our opinions. So, in this quote, again, let's keep this in mind, as with many of these, when we're reading On Truth and Lying in a non-moral sense. So there he talks about how truths are these metaphors where we've forgotten that they're metaphors and now they've been worn out as coins and they don't they're only used for their exchange value. So let's talk about some of the ways in which in contemporary literary theory we see Nietzsche's perspectivism at work. So within contemporary literary theory, his metaphysics of the will to power and perspectivism is the fundamental point of departure for structuralism and post-structuralism. So in Ferdinand de Saussure's linguistics, a sign has no intrinsic positivity, no essence, no thingness. It is purely differential, constituted by the relations within the system. So Saussure insists that neither the signifier nor the signified, and we'll talk more about that in the next week of the course. Next week of the course will be on Saussure and structuralism, and so influential. After Nietzsche, after Heidegger, Saussure is probably the most influential. And well, that's difficult. There's Marx in there and Freud, but in any case, we'll talk more detail about Saussure, but for now, signifier is the let's say the written word or the spoken word, for example, of a sign, and the signified is the concept that may be elicited by that signifier. So if I say cat, maybe you have, and that's a signifier, cat, you have a concept in your mind of a four-legged furry animal. That's the signified. That's what is signified by the signifier. The two together are the sign. So for Saussure, neither the signifier nor the signified has any independent identity. Each is defined only by what it is not, and by these relations in the system. Meaning arises from the network of oppositions, not from any inherent content. And a quote from Saussure: in language, there are only differences and no positive terms. Here's a graphic representation of this signifying system, the functional relation of signifiers in a signifying system. And since Saussure, there's been network analysis theory that we can use as a kind of an analog for structuralist theory of language. And this conception of language is akin to Nietzsche's notion that there is no thing in itself, only relations of interpretation or perspective. So in this diagram, each node, let us say, could be seen as a signifier or a signified, and each is constituted by its relations to the other signifiers in the system. So perspectivism and post-structuralism. So Gilles Deleuze, and that's him on the right there, his book Nietzsche and Philosophy in 1962 was when that was published. It's an excellent work on Nietzsche, I think. I don't agree with everything in it. He has a particular perspective, let's say. He has a particular point of view on these things. I don't agree with everything there, but it definitely brings out the implications of Nietzsche's philosophy, at least when it comes to this notion of perspectivism. And he radicalizes that and says, okay, well, let's think this through a bit more, and interprets the will to power and perspectivism as this differential relations of quantities and qualities of force. He really brings out that angle. And it's there in Nietzsche, but he really brings that out. And that becomes the foundation. Deleuze's work on that, first of all, it started a vogue of Nietzsche in the 60s and 70s with these French post-structuralists, and his notion of the differential relations of quantities of force becomes something that is really picked up by the other post-structuralists as well. So this this notion of identity as an illusory epiphenomenon of differential relations was to be a mainstay of post-structural thinkers' interpretation of linguistic identity in terms of Derrida, psychic social in terms with Lacan, or power relations with Foucault. So I think when I talk about great books on Nietzsche, that for me, and I think I mentioned this last time, but for me, Heidegger is the most important. Heidegger's uh, huge and intimidating work on Nietzsche. It's 4 volumes, published in English as uh, 2 volumes, with the 4 put together into 2. His work on Nietzsche, Heidegger, so that's one. Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy, totally different perspective, but equally important. And then third, Lawrence Lampert's Nietzsche's Teaching, which is a very close reading of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So to continue with this discussion of perspectivism and post-structuralism, Jacques Derrida developed an elaborate philosophy of différance. So you'll notice here the French term différance is with an E here instead of an A. But Derrida purposefully misspells it with an A, and makes différance this concept of how identity is formed through differential relations. And he wants to use this typographical difference, this spelling difference, because they sound the same in phonetic speech, basically. And however, it's only in writing that we see the difference, so to speak, between différence in French and différence, Derrida's différence. So that points to one of his themes about there always being a writing and difference behind what we think of as presence or identity. One of his early works is a collection of essays collected under the title Writing and Difference. Very good collection. I would recommend that. So here's a quote from his essay Différence, an important work of his written, I think, 1968. The first consequence to be drawn from this is that the signified concept is never present in and of itself. So straight from Saussure. In a sufficient presence that would refer only to itself. Essentially and lawfully, every concept is inscribed in a chain or in a system within which it refers to other concepts by means of the systemic play of differences. Such a play, différence, is thus no longer simply a concept, but rather the possibility of conceptuality, a conceptual process and system in general. So Derrida's language is notoriously convoluted, and here this is actually one of the more clear passages you'll find in Derrida, but he's doing that for a reason. And but I think we can see clearly enough in this passage this notion of differential relations as being kind of the truth, so to speak, underneath any notion of a unified concept or a unified thing. Also for Foucault, and that's Michel Foucault on the right, the notion of the will to power and perspectivism finds its way into Foucault and then later race and gender theorists via Foucault. Okay, so here again, the stress is on, in terms of Foucault's analysis of power. Power is not an entity in itself, and it's not something that's possessed by an entity. I have power. So there's an entity, me, and I possess this thing called power, and I can give it to somebody else. I can delegate authority, we say in organizational structures. Rather, these power is itself constituted by relations and forces. And here's a quote from Foucault's essay, Truth and Power. The individual is not to be conceived as a sort of elementary nucleus, a primitive atom, a multiple and inert material on which power comes to fasten or against which it happens to strike. In fact, it is already one of the prime effects of power. So the individual does not hold power. The individual is a product of power relations. It is already one of the prime effects of power that certain bodies, certain gestures, certain discourses, certain desires come to be identified and constituted as individuals. Again, straight from Nietzsche, but nuanced slightly to talk about power relations and how that manifests itself in discourses. So Foucault, again, heavily influenced by Nietzsche. And then Judith Butler, in her landmark work, Gender Trouble, heavily influenced by Foucault and via Foucault, Nietzsche. So to here, we're not going to think about gender as an identifiable thing that an individual has. So an individual with a constant identity, and one of the attributes is gender with it as an identifiable thing. Rather, gender is a function of different forces, and for gender theory a la Butler, the way of describing these forces that make up gender is to describe them as expressions or performances. So gender is a performative. So if I wear something, if I do something, if I say something, these are kind of vectors or perspectives or forces that allow certain expressions of gender to coalesce and then be identified as, well, that's female and that's male. So here's a quote from Gender Trouble. There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. So, in our normal thinking about gender, we would say, okay, well, so and so's a woman, and therefore, they have it as an expression of that fundamental, essential nature of womanness. They do X, Y, and Z. Maybe that means in our traditional notions of gender, caring mother, likes to be nurturing of family members, etc. Less aggressive in social situations. These are the ways we would traditionally, let's say, identify those gender expressions of an essence. Whereas for Judith Butler and gender theorists after Butler, there is the womanness is constructed afterwards by a series of social and discursive expressions that happen to coalesce around different things, and then through social conventions that are never articulated consciously, we say, okay, yeah, that's womanness, and that's going to evolve over time, historically, and through different social and cultural practices. So I'll leave off there. There are a few examples where Nietzsche's perspectivism, his philosophy of the will to power, find its way, and these are bit teasers, and we'll see them more fully as we go to these schools later, how Nietzsche's philosophy of will to power and perspectivism find their way in some contemporary literary theories. Next time, we'll close off our discussion of Nietzsche with a look at his essay on truth and lying in a non-moral sense. Thank you very much.